Well, I heard there were already rumors going around about my walk yesterday, so I thought I would tell you the story from my own perspective because it's a good teaching story for what happens with walking with devas. So there are several parts of this. The first thing you need to understand is a Sanskrit word, samskara. So the actual meaning of this word is ritual, but it also means habit or routine. And it was borrowed by Madame Blavatsky and has somewhat dropped out of people's awareness. My understanding of it is if we have powerful thoughts that we think over and over and over again, we create a thought form container for those thoughts. Feelings also. That thought form container I call a samskara. And I perceive it and I conceive of it as like a vase or a vase. It's, it fills up, it has a certain amount that it can hold, but it has a rounded bottom, and so it's not stable. So you fill this thing up, and then the devas and the nature spirits are always looking for the right time to tip it over. And when they tip it over, all of the thought and feeling energy that was stored in it pours out and becomes an event in your life. And this happens all the time. So one of the things that we can learn when we work with devas is how to make our karma easier. Because if we can talk to the devas before the container empties, then we may be able to empty the energy out, and then we don't have a difficult experience that we have to deal with. The devas do this with good thoughts. They do it with not so good thoughts. And so anytime you're planning something and you're working really hard to create it, for example, all of the organization that went into creating this week, what happens is the devas look for all the samskaras. Everybody brought samskaras with them, expectations, for example. And then they'll start tipping them over little bit by little bit, and that energy will get poured in. It will become a part of the group experience that's being created. So this is a very important concept, and we may need to talk about it some more over the course of the next few days. But here is an example of what is meant by a samskara. And it is, in a sense, a trivial example and also a humorous example, but it's a good one, I think, for you to understand what I'm talking about here. Okay, so last week at the end of the program, two of my German friends were here, and they were going to give me a ride to a supermarket so I could buy some things like chocolate, because I have no car and I wanted chocolate, right? And so I had heard that recently a Lidl had opened up, which is the kind of supermarket. So of the two people who worked at St. Michael's house, one of them, Luce, who was the cook, only knew about Albert Heijn, which is another supermarket. But Yunoen, she knew about Lidl. So I said to my friends, I would like to go to Lidl, because I had been to one in America. I wanted to see what it looked like. And they said, no, we go to Albert Heijn. Because they had asked Luce, and they knew where it was. And I said, no, I want to go to Lidl. Yunoen knows where Lidl is. No, we looked at our GPS. We're going to Albert Heijn. So as we're on our way, I'm looking everywhere for Lidl, because if it's there, I say, stop there. We found Albert Heijn, but then we couldn't find the parking lot, but then we found Echo Plaza, which is even better. So that's like an organic health grocery store. So we didn't go to Albert Heijn, we didn't go to Lidl. Okay, that's the beginning. So a samskara was created by my desire to go to Lidl, because I was very willful about this. All right, now we'll set that aside for a moment. So the next thing that happened was I was wandering around St. Michael House, and I found a room that had some books in it, and among the books was a book about fairies in England. And so I thought, oh, this is interesting, and I looked at it, and it turned out to be a very rare book, and I was very happy. I can tell the library about it now. I wanted to buy a copy for myself. $200, $700. That was the range. There were 2 copies for sale. So I'm thinking, okay, I'll just photograph the pages. So as I photographed the pages, I came to a passage that said, the tradition in England is that fairies like to mislead travelers. They send you on the wrong path. Well, okay, so that was my experience yesterday. I went out for a walk. I intended to spend an hour or an hour and a half. Instead, I was out for 3 hours. Why was I out for 3 hours? Because of the dwarf in the woods, right? It was a painted dwarf. It was not, one that you see with your clairvoyant vision. So here's what happened. I was walking down a bicycle trail, and I came eventually to a place where there was a tea house and coffee house. And I thought, maybe I'll turn around here. So I turned around, and here is this picture of a dwarf, so high, and it was making this gesture. So I don't know what it means. So I started walking down the trail, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm on my way home now, and then I see a parking lot, and I say, oh, I didn't see that on the way here. And I thought, oh, well, it's okay, I just keep going this way, and then I will end up with back here at the center. I went through some beautiful fields, and the sky was so open and blue, and the hay or the grass or the crops were so green. It was really a beautiful walk. And then I thought, oh, but I'm not seeing anybody, and I don't exactly know where I am. I'm following my intuition as I go. Finally, I say, okay, I think I need to listen to where the cars are coming from and go where the cars are. So I do. I'm now in the town of Huizen, which is quite far from here, standing in front of the Leland. So, it's 5 minutes till closing time, but I go in, I ask, can anyone give me directions? It's the third person who knows how to tell me how to go. So, I start walking, I walk a certain distance, I go through a traffic circle, I continue walking, I turn right where I was told to turn right, where there was a church, and a little farther on, I saw a sign that said balcony, which is the name of this area. And I thought, oh, well that wasn't in the directions, but I will go that way. So I began to walk in that direction, and after some 15 or 20 minutes, here is the dwarf again, standing in front of me. I had gone in a big circle. So I thought, okay, I'll do it right this time. I started walking down the same path, I saw the parking lot, and then I thought, maybe there's a map in the parking lot, so I went to look. And what I discovered was that where the dwarf stood, there were these 2 trails, and the sign that he was making was to let you know that there was a division, and that you had to know which side you wanted to be on. And so I had to go back to the dwarf again, and finally I was on the right path to come back. So, with the legal, there was this, as I mentioned, a samskara. The nature spirits waited until they could dump it out. They dumped it out in my walk, but they did it in conjunction with the dwarf, so I would know that it was they who were interfering, so to speak, unaware of. And what I love about it is I was misled, but I was guided at the same time. They love to play jokes like that, so I thought you would appreciate the story. So before we go on to the subject of the morning, does anyone have any questions or comments about this story? Okay, so whenever we create a thought form, whenever we fill up one of these samskaras, it exists on a higher level of being, but it has to manifest itself. It has to dump itself out into physical reality for us to be free of it. In an interesting way, when I came back to the dwarf, if I hadn't seen the map, I would have made the same circle again. And that could have been the rest of my week, making that circle. So the idea is that it has to be poured out, and when it's poured out, that habit or the intention behind it is no longer acting on your life. But if you think about people who have obsessive thoughts about, let's say, hatred or something, those thoughts have to be poured out too. And then there will be a situation where the devas will find a way to do it that creates the least possible damage, but enough to let the person know that it's unhealthy to think that way. So there's always a teaching element. But sometimes there are national samskaras that also become involved. So those of you who have seen the news of all of the mass shootings in the United States, those are also samskaras, but it's not just about an individual, it's about the whole polarization of politics there. I can actually tell you an even more dramatic story about samskaras now that you understand the nature of them. So I had two friends. They were going to get married, and then a third person came into the relationship, and the woman started moving in his direction, and all three of them were very close friends of mine, and they were all part of a spiritual group, and so this was a very dangerous situation. So I had gotten a phone call in the morning that let me know that I needed to intervene to talk to the people to make sure that everything would go forward smoothly. And then I left my house and I went to do my laundry. In my apartment building, there wasn't good laundry, and so I had to go down the street to a place where you could pay to do your laundry. So after I put my laundry in the machines, I took a walk. And the walk was to go and get something to eat for breakfast. And as I did this, I saw a huge truck turn down a tiny, narrow, one-way street. And I thought, no, this isn't good. And as I watched the truck come, I saw how high it was, and the wires for the for the telephone and electricity were too low. So I was always watching the truck move, and at one point, the truck snapped the wires, and the wires came at me. And I actually had to run and dive into someone's driveway to get away from them. So that let me know that the situation between these people was really serious, that it had reached a breaking point, and that there would be a big discharge of electricity, emotional electricity. So that was the devas warning me about something happening. So I came back, I made the phone calls, I started the process of working this through. Eventually the two people got married, the third person stayed friends with everybody, but went out of the picture, and so everything was smooth. In the middle of all of this, though, I discovered that another truck had come down that street, and there are gardens in that area for people who live in the apartments. They had taken a huge amount of horse manure for the garden and put it in a pile right at the end of the street. And when everything was resolved with my friends, that huge pile of horse manure was gone. So somehow there was this strange symbol about, well, in America we talk about horse shit, and people have to move through. There it was. So, my life is like this. The signs are always there. The devas are doing these things. They let me know something was really dangerous. It helped me, deal with it, and everything turned out well. My friends are still married. My other friend has a much better partner now, so all is good. But there was BS to work through. Okay, so the Hindus in Sanskrit have a wonderful word, I'm sure you've heard it, Leela, the play of the gods, or the play of Shiva, or the play of Krishna. There are different ways of talking about it. And I think that Fatima is exactly right. We don't see the humor because when we are the end of the joke, our personality doesn't like it. But if we know about what we're taught in Theosophy about we have to erase the personality. Then, of course, part of the game is for the devas to watch us have our fit, about it. But from their perspective, it's only learning and growth. There's no desire to do harm. And yet harm is done, but then if you look, for example, in an earthquake, harm is often done there. But that's also the result of the samskara, and many individual samskaras, and a regional one, and a national one, and sometimes, in some cases, with climate change, an international one. All of these are involved, and the suffering that is created is trying to get people to wake up, either to something they shouldn't be doing in terms of harm, or something they should be doing in terms of unity consciousness, coming together to help and support people. Okay, so going back to this idea, here's how I conceive of the way karma works. So, some of you are probably familiar with steampunk. It's a sort of 19th century, 20th century, well, let's see, how can I explain it? So in the 19th century, when everything was run by steam, some people in current days, for movies and videos and science fiction novels, they asked the question, what would it be like if we were still only operating with steam, but had everything else that goes along with being, contemporary? The reason I'm bringing it up is these steam networks can run a whole city, and it used to be that they tried to do it in the 19th century. So you can think of karma as a waterworks or as a steam network. The pressure builds up, there are pressure valves. The devas will look to see which valves need to be turned and how much and from where. And all of our events are essentially a creation of the devas working with the waterworks, but only ever with the emotional and thought pressures that we've created ourselves through our samskaras. And so, when they make the plan, they try to do it for the maximum amount of growth for everyone. For some people, that might seem like harm. For other people, it might seem like something to laugh about, even with the same event. It all depends on how consciously aware we are of how this game, so to speak, is operating in the background. But the thing you have to understand is, we go to science class and we learn how there are universal laws and they can never be broken under any circumstance. And if a deva is behind the law, then it seems that the deva can have no free will or no intelligence, really, beyond just fulfilling the law. But then, if we're playing a game, we have rules. Those are the laws of the game. And if we break them, what happens? The game breaks up. We might win, but everybody hates us because they see that we cheated, So we have to abide in order to have the fun of playing the game. So think about the devas. They have the power to disrupt things, but they don't because they're working for the source. And you can think of it as a free will choice or not. Their pleasure, their joy, is to express the joy of the source in doing their work and playing at the same time. Because if we can't laugh at ourselves, as I was talking about with the young Theosophists, we only have suffering here, And I'm not saying that we laugh at the suffering, but if we see the irony, often it's irony, of what we experience versus what we're looking for, then we begin a process of learning how to change that. And one of the steps of changing that is learning to talk with the devas, to figure out what it is that we can change in order for an event to turn out in a somewhat different way. Again, there are many, many different ways we can talk about this. You can feel an event coming on before it happens. That's what happened in the situation where the truck was going down the wrong street. I got an advance warning of what was going on before the actual talk occurred between the three people. So if we think of those moments as a warning that we need to turn inward, we can feel the pressure of the event coming through, we can actually ask for inner guidance. What can I do to help to be an agent of turning stuckness into flow, as I talked about yesterday, in order to make this work out for the very best, support for learning and growth for everyone involved, and the least amount of suffering. And so one of the things I'll recommend later in the week is that we think about what it means to be an agent of turning stuckness into flow. Because essentially what we're doing is we're saying, I'm available to help with the workings of karma and to decrease the suffering in the world by increasing the understanding of what's going on behind the scenes with karma. Okay, so there's a saying in English, no good deed should go unrewarded. But what often happens is the reward is the opposite of good. You know? This is the result of what you're talking about. We fill up samskaras with all kinds of good intentions, and then there's karma that we've ignored, and when we offer ourselves to help other people, then we open ourselves to the devas, allowing us to have the pleasure, but then having the person perhaps not be very grateful for what we're doing. That would be just one example of what you're talking about. So the thing is, if we're going to be an agent of turning stuckness into flow, we really have to be willing to be responsible for the consequences of our actions, even the ones we're not aware of. And simply that attitude will enable things to work out in a better way. Because mostly what happens is people say to themselves, I should have known not to do that. But the thing is, if you really knew not to do it, you wouldn't have done it. And when you say, I should have known better, you push it away, and then it happens again. It happens as long as it takes for you to say, yes, I acknowledge I created this, or this is for my learning. So, on one of the last afternoons of our time together, I'll be teaching a meditative practice that involves such things as taking responsibility for the consequences of our actions and also becoming an agent of turning stuckness into flow. So that's probably a better answer to your question. Yeah. Someone else? By the way, Annie Besant puts it a little bit differently, but if you want to know more about the relationship between thought forms and karma, her little book on karma that was published in the 1890s is an excellent resource. More mindfulness is always needed. That we can always do more in that direction. But again, for me as a seer, because I pay attention to my dreams and I write them down and I understand them, what I've learned is that everything we experience in physical reality is also like a dream symbol. And if you pay attention, you can read it and understand it. Just like with the snapped wires and the electricity in the story that I told. Anything can be interpreted in that same way. That takes not just paying attention, but also some kind of inner listening to find the correlation between what's happening inside and the meaning of the event. But this is a typical aspect of so-called clairvoyance called omens, which is, anything that we see that symbolizes something. A common one is an owl flies in front of us. Because an owl doesn't fly in front of us every day, we think that it has some kind of significance. What we don't know is, at that moment, we were having a thought that we needed to pay attention to. And a deva touched the owl on the shoulder and said, fly. And the owl flew, and then we think about the owl and how significant it is, but lose the thought that the deva was trying to get us to pay attention to. There were street lights in my neighborhood that would somehow go off. You'd walk under them and they would just go off. This was 30 years ago. And what I noticed is that every time I walked under one and it went off, I was thinking something that was a thought that I should get rid of. And but one time on a day where I was really, really aware, I turned off every light on the whole street. Each time as I walked, it would go off. So the universe is talking to us all the time through nature and through these little things, and paying attention is the beginning, but then making an inner connection to what we're seeing is the other part of it. There was another thing I wanted to say about your statement. Let me think. Yeah, I just want to emphasize again, anything can be interpreted as symbolic. And you can start to see the interconnections that operate behind the scenes. So for example, I'm not sure how whether all of you are aware of this, but from last year's Young Theosophists gathering, I've been told there was a post that had been sent out that talked about how we're all shells. We're all like different shells, and the shells were all illustrated. And the person who showed me this said, and now we have the box of shells this year. We're all taking the shells and using them, and we're taking them home with us. So you see something like that, and then you realize, there's all of this other work that's going on. It was because of the samskara of the love that was created that connection was able to come across to the next year and then manifest itself in a more visible form. So there's an infinite amount of learning about the relationship between thought forms, samskaras, karma, and magic too, because if we talk to the devas, there is a limit to what we can do to change an event when it's about to manifest itself, but we can turn it so that it's a little more for the greater good. And eventually we learn how to do that, and we get what we're needing, but we also participate in an event where lots of people get what they need, and the harm might be lessened, or it might be eliminated in some cases. So. It's trial and error. You have to try it and see where it takes you, and if it takes you someplace helpful, that was good, and if it doesn't, it wasn't good. And after a while, you learn to know the difference between that kind of thing when it's guidance and that kind of thing when it's a distraction. So, yeah, it takes decades sometimes. The great enemy of all spiritual growth and of any kind of psychic or spiritual development, in my opinion, is what could be called family and social conditioning. And so we have to constantly be aware of that, and we have to break it down. The value of any kind of travel is that for a while family and social conditioning is suspended. The value of travel that brings you together with people who are of like mind is exactly the same. The thing is, taking this with you is a little bit like having had a mystical experience that came out of nowhere. The question is, how do I live in such a way that can become my experience all the time? And if you just hold that as a question, each morning when you wake up, and then work from there, the family and social conditioning loosens up and you can have these experiences. One very simple way to do it is if you think of the lower principles of our being, the moral principles like the body, prana, kama, or desire, manas, as being a limited self. And then if you think about the higher aspect, higher manas, buddhi, and atman, as an unlimited self, what you can do each morning or as often as you like in the course of the day is just take a moment of silence, turn inward, and say, I would like to live from my unlimited self all the time. And that will move you in that direction. Now, I would like to is an invitation to the devas to teach you how to do that in a way that doesn't overwhelm you. If you make a demand out of it, like, I'm going to live from my unlimited self all the time, you might suddenly be out of space and time, and then you can't go to work, and then you lose your job. And then on and on it goes. So whenever you're working with the devas, you always want to invite. So I hope that helps. Yeah. I'm fairly certain that God doesn't care whether I got to Leland or not. And then if I start to work by process of elimination from the higher levels down, probably the archangels were not involved. Probably the angels were not involved. Then I get down to the nature spirits. Yeah, that's probably where it happened. And I mean, I even had a dwarf to look at. It wasn't an angel that misled me. But the point that I'm saying is, yeah, it's a brave new world. Yeah, there are all these new species to think about, and then different levels and how do they communicate with you and so on and so forth. You have to live with it for a while. The way one of my friends puts it, which I absolutely love, she was brought up Christian but is now Buddhist, is when I pray to whoever is on duty. And that could be a nature spirit, or it could be an angel, or it could be something higher than that. But the thing is, just be grateful. You don't have to name it. Just be grateful. You don't have to say, nature spirits, help me. You just say, okay, this is what I need, and then throw it out there, and whoever's on duty, if it's good for you in terms of learning and growth, they will show up. And if you need to know who they are and what their name is, and whether you can contact them again, they might be able to make some arrangements along those lines. Oh yeah, I wanted to tell you a story. This is a little story about the challenge of learning to communicate with other beings, because we have lots of assumptions. One of the assumptions is that everybody in the universe is just like us. We have that problem with animals, which we don't want to forget about because we have a half an hour left. But with respect to beings on the other side, I had a friend who was trained as a spiritualist. And the spiritualists often tend to be on the consciousness-empathy spectrum. And so relationship is a really important thing for them. So whenever he would have an astral travel experience, he would see a being of some kind who was there to be a teacher, and he would march up to them and reach out his hand and try to shake hands with them and say, "Hi, my name is Carl. What's your name?" And the beings would always go. Because there aren't names over there. We're all identified by a particular pattern of energy, and we know that, we can communicate that way, but it's not a name. And so basically, he was showing up, which is half the problem for most people, but he was showing up in a way that wasn't teachable because of the family and social conditioning around what it means to be human. So the relevance of that to your story is we don't need to know the different levels or the names. But it might be important. There might be a teacher who wants to come back, but then they test us by showing us in lots and lots of different ways. Showing themselves in lots of different ways. So this same friend, he had an inner teacher who was showing up who was the most radiantly beautiful, loving female being he ever met, that he was so much more attracted to than his wife, that he felt enormously guilty about it. And whenever he met her, he would go into ecstasies of bliss in his astral body, and then turn it into a sex dream. In other words, he would fall out of the state of consciousness where he could communicate with this person and instead have just, some kind of sensual relationship with them. So what he needed to do was to learn how to experience the greater love that is always present for us when we're working with these beings, and not have it channeled into family and social conditioning around sexuality. And this particular being kept not playing jokes on him, but testing him to see whether he could deal with the energy behind the being and not how he saw the being. So the being would then show up as this radiantly beautiful man, and then he would say to himself, oh, I'm so attracted to you, I must be gay. But that wasn't the lesson at all. The lesson was to understand the truth of a person's identity regardless of the way it manifests itself visually. All right, time for animals or we'll run out of time. So, we have to learn to think about and experience the world differently. So, I'll use a couple of examples. No one will ever think of this as an example of clairvoyance, yet it's the root of clairvoyance. So if you are a gardener and plants love you and they thrive and grow when you're working with them, it's because at some level you are being responsive to their needs. And they recognize that and then they flourish. If you have houseplants and you're able to keep them alive, you might be able to sense when they need water. And it's not just a matter of looking at the soil. It may be a matter of your own thoughts being somewhat disrupted by the need of the plant. I've gone into households where there were houseplants, and the houseplants are all going, we're not getting enough water, we're not getting enough water. And, I'll say something to them about it, and, oh yeah, I forgot, or, oh no, they only need it once every 10 days. Well, they needed it more often than that. Now, the thing is, this was something that happened to me in my 20s before I was very developed. It's the kind of thing that can happen to anybody. People don't look at it because they don't think of plants as conscious beings that we can have a relationship with through our own consciousness. So the same thing can apply to animals and probably does in an even bigger way. So for those of us who have pets, there can definitely develop a relationship, consciousness to consciousness with a pet, where there doesn't need to be verbal communication about what needs to happen. For me, it can be a little extreme. So again, in my 20s, if my parents were going away for vacation, I would go to the house and they had 2 dogs. And the dogs were of the kind that if they were inside, they wanted to be outside, and if they were outside, they wanted to be inside. And what I discovered was if I wanted to do any writing, I couldn't because the needs of the dogs were totally taking over my thoughts. And literally, I would have only just stood at the door and opened the door and closed it over and over and over again. But again, it's an ability that you can develop step by step to know what's needed from a dog, not just by the dog's barking or by the dog coming and looking at you with big eyes, like they do sometimes, or even by just doing it by habit and routine at a certain time of day where they need to go outside. It's something where, it's the basis of clairvoyance in the sense that I've been talking about it. It's something we all experience and you can build on. If you can do it with animals and you haven't tried it with plants, make that experiment. Parents of really young children, especially mothers, often have these relationships with their children. It's another form of clairvoyance. So, but it can also be more refined. So for example, some years ago, I was visiting a farm where there was a horse, and I noticed that it was a very, very hot day, and I noticed that the horse was licking my hand. And I said to the owner of the horse, this horse needs salt, because I just knew that the reason it was licking my hand was it needed salt. And the next day, the horse collapsed. And my friend said that he was freaked out. He's like, how did you predict it? How did you predict it? Well, to me, it seemed perfectly obvious. But there was an element of intuition because the horse was trying to communicate something to me, and I actually got the message. So it turns out that the block of salt that was put out in the field for the horse had been taken away because some worms had gotten in it. And so that was why the horse didn't have the salt. My friend thought that I could do that all the time with everybody and was afraid to talk to me after that. But it was so simple. we can have these experiences all the time and not recognize them as instances of intuition. Another one is the little dog of some friends of mine, who's adorable, noticed one time that I was washing a yogurt cup and was looking at me like that. And I didn't know that sometimes when the dog's mom and dad was washing out a yogurt cup, they would give it to the dog to lick. But I got it, so I put it down there, and he loved it, and he started to realize that there was a direct communication between us. That he did something, he projected the thought to me, and I got the thought and did it back for him. And so one time he was in an emergency situation when we were camping, and his parents' camp was a little farther away than mine. He came running up to me with these big eyes, looking at me like this, because he felt like I was the only one who would know what to do about the situation that he was in. And unfortunately, I didn't know what to do about it, but the dog knew that I could do that and came to me trying to get a message across that he couldn't get across to his parents. So, sorry if you're not used to this. This is the American relationship with dogs. I guess it's kind of a meme, A friend of mine was showing me videos of women saying, "When I birthed my dog, blah, 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 blah." So, anyway, what I'd like for you to take away from this is just to recognize that you probably have all had experiences like this. You can always ask for more, notice them, and the most important thing is accept them as a consciousness experience. You don't have to label it as ESP. It's not in any way grand, and yet it becomes the basis for believing something somewhat more extreme when it happens, or somewhat more unexpected. Another thing is, my partner comes home, I give an embrace, and immediately I'm able to say, "Oh, you're in this kind of mood, and you had this kind of day, and 3 or 4 things like this." Well, he's gotten used to it. So it's a real challenge for people to get used to knowing what's going on inside other people. And yet, it's very natural, and it can develop really, really easily from just a hug. All you have to do is just say, "Okay, what am I feeling here?" And then report it back, and hopefully your partner's comfortable with the feedback, and hasn't done anything that day they don't want you to know about. So, any questions or comments? There are several points that are very actually good for me to highlight as clear. So effectively what you're talking about is what I would call causal body thinking. Causal body thinking is able to perceive forces in play and able to depersonalize things and only see the will and the beliefs and values that are behind the will, sometimes the family and social conditioning that's also present, and then see how they're coming together, and then feel how it's heating up, and then it goes into what I call a black box, which is where the devas start pouring in karma from past lives even, and then comes out as an explosion or some event. So if you're able to track these things, you can actually choose several different kinds of relationships with it. One of them is your own participation. So for example, as an observer, the question is, would these observations be helpful for someone? Or am I responsible for making these observations available just because I have them? Or should I intervene in some way because I see what the next step would be and it's clear that they don't see it? So the first thing I want to say is, in terms of one's relationship to a situation like this, there always has to be either an invitation from the people or a call if they're not capable. And wanting to save or rescue is not a call, obviously. So that's the first point. The second one is, with the attitude of working it out sooner rather than later, I would agree with you that if it's enforced obsessively, it becomes another force in play. And the fact that they want a solution and to be beyond the solution into some concept of happiness, they'll never get there because they're both trying to hurry up a process that needs its time to develop and unfold. If they can be supported in taking a time out, that's perfectly acceptable. There's no inevitability about the blow-up. It can happen sooner or later. It can happen stronger or less. The Devas are always willing to work with us if we're willing to do our growth. The difficulty, though, is there's always a growth by self-remembering and a growth that is at the leading edge of who we are. Growth by self-remembering is bringing forward lessons that we learned in a past life. So in many cases, because of our family and social conditioning, certain things that we bring in terms of wisdom from past lives, they're not available to us until we break through the conditioning. And some of our karma will be of that kind, self-remembering karma. But then, if we're dealing with a situation that we've never experienced before, that would be leading edge of our growth. And in that case, if you see someone constantly struggling, you have to assume that whatever it is that they need to learn is not something they already know. And in that case, if you are operating from a somewhat higher perspective, you can see how what they're experiencing is completely avoidable. And they can't see it, and they can't be convinced of it by you. The ironic thing about being a Buddhist in a situation such as this is they have a wrong view on what karma is. And the Buddha says, get rid of wrong views. And the wrong view is creating suffering, which the Buddha says is the law. And they can't free themselves from it. So what Buddhist practice are they doing is my question, you know? And it's entirely possible that approaching the problem from that perspective could solve it, because it gets them thinking about their practice and out of the bind that they're in, where their understanding of karma is constantly reenacting itself, and there's no growth or evolution in it because it isn't a workable view. There's nothing to learn but that you have to abandon it. So I hope that answers your question. In a sense, this is a natural question coming from, because it hinges on the question of when are we called, or how are we called to do something. But I want to expand the range of thinking about the question before I answer it. So everyone knows that the Buddha says that the root of suffering is ignorance and attachment. And yet, no one seems to think about the word suffering in this connection, because we can all relate to it because we've all suffered. The big question is, if we're here to alleviate, this is something Blavatsky says, if we're here to alleviate the suffering of other beings, what does that mean? What happens more often than not is we suffer from knowing that they suffer, and then we feel that there's nothing we can do. So now there's more suffering in the world instead of less. So my understanding, my personal understanding, but I think it's useful possibly for other people, is that what the Buddha really meant by suffering wasn't what we think of as suffering. What the Buddha really meant was what I'm going to call needfulness. We all exist in a state of needfulness. As long as that state exists, we're suffering in that area of our life where the thing we need is not coming to us. When the thing that we need comes to us, there's a feeling of satisfaction and it disappears. But then there's always another need that comes after that. So how does our relationship with ourselves and the universe change when we think of the root of all suffering, quote unquote, is unsatisfied needs. Now, we have to be clear that we're talking about true needs here. We're not talking about whether I need to buy a Corvette or something like that. So, if we get clear about our true needs, our whole relationship with the universe changes, because we will understand that if there is a need we can satisfy for an animal, and we're called to do that, we can do it, and the animal and the universe will not be harmed. But there are many, many needs of animals, including the need not to be involved with humans, that we would have to understand. And if we're only seeing suffering as something we have to take away, then we don't have a clear perspective on it, and we can do harm. So, if there's an animal that has been hit by a car and is struggling, the question then is, do you free it from its suffering, or do you take it to a place where perhaps it can be healed? You have then taken it out of the wild, it then becomes involved with human beings, and maybe it will never leave a nature center, but maybe it would only have died if it was sitting by the side of the road. We have to understand in a situation like this that the human and the animal both learn something by interaction in the nature center. And this can be valuable for both sides. It may not be something that gets fed back to the group consciousness of the animal. It wouldn't have any direct connection with it. And who knows, but that animal could not perhaps become a reservoir of heredity for a species that's becoming extinct at some point. And therefore there's a reason for it to be in that protected space. So it's a much larger question that you're asking, but I think that's probably the simplest answer. And the takeaway is, and this is probably the most radical thing that I'm going to say during my entire time here, if you get clear about your true needs, and if you recognize that we live in a universe of needs, and if you are working to alleviate suffering through the satisfaction of needs, the whole experience of so-called clairvoyance just opens up, because that is the reality that we all exist in this soup, so to speak, of forces in play around needs. And we force it, or we accept it, or we suffer from it and fall down into depression, but really understanding it in the right way and realizing that devas are here to help us satisfy our needs. This is what is essentially the gateway to the invisible worlds. It's to accept that we live in a universe of needs and to want to be helpful somehow for minerals, for plants, for animals, for beings at any level. Even the devas have needs. So one of their needs is to teach us, including teaching us through suffering if we don't want to learn. And on it goes. So we have 5 minutes before lunch. I think it's a good point for us to break.
Thank you.